Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and I know she's going to be joined by Representative Miller hopefully soon. The ranking member, Mr. Meadows, is on his way, but I'm going to get started so that we don't have undue delays for the hearing. I was 17 years old when Robert Kennedy, then Senator from New York, father of 10 children at the time, traveled to the Mississippi Delta to see firsthand the hunger and poverty experienced by the families and children living there. He was inspired to do so by congressional testimony from a civil rights lawyer named Marion Wright Edelman, at the time Marion Wright. She was the founder of the Children's Defense Fund and the first African-American woman admitted to the Mississippi bar. The images of RFK's tour were searing. They left an indelible mark on our national images and understanding of poverty, and they showed the nation the faces of people who are all too often otherwise forgotten. 50 years later, we're revisiting Marion Wright's testimony, but this time the face of the administration's assault on the poor. Today we commence a series of 4 hearings that will lay bare the Trump administration's attempts to gut regulations and programs that protect the health and welfare of our nation's children. This hearing in particular will examine what it means to experience poverty in America, explore the inaccuracy of the federal government's current and proposed measures of poverty, and consider our government's responsibility to help Americans struggling to break free from the cycle of poverty. Specifically, we'll look at how our recent Trump administration proposal to recalculate the poverty threshold would in fact make poverty lines less accurate and deprive hundreds of thousands of children access to critical health care and nutritional benefits. In May 2019, the Office of Management and Budget published a proposal to change the inflation index used to calculate annually the poverty threshold. While a switch to a different cost of living adjustment may seem like a small measure and a technicality, the ripple effects of this proposal are not. They would be quite consequential. If OMB elected to use a chained consumer price index, CPI, for example, the poverty line's growth would slow by about 0.2 percentage points a year, not because we'd conquered poverty, but because we simply redefined it. If the administration moves to a chain price index, by 2030, the poverty line for a family of 4 would be $691 lower than it would be using the existing inflation index. Over time, the impact of using that CPI, chain CPI to calculate the poverty threshold compounds, prompting really consequential impacts on families and children who rely on social safety net to access food, health care, and eventually to escape poverty. While a 691 reduction of the poverty line may seem like a modest impact, it's not, especially when you're living day by day, dollar by dollar, to make ends meet, as all too many Americans still are. After 10 years, with the chain CPI reducing the poverty line by roughly 2%, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that more than 300,000 children would lose health care. More than 200,000 school-aged children would lose eligibility for free or reduced price school meals. That number, by the way, is bigger than the entire school system of my district, my county, which is the 10th largest school district in America. Nearly 200,000 people, mostly in working households, would lose their Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program or SNAP benefits. And 40,000 infants and young children would lose benefits for supplemental nutrition. Those are not insignificant numbers. The 2% drop in inflation would affect eligibility in 80 anti-poverty programs, and the impacts of that are yet to be measured. Children would lose access to these life-changing programs not because their parents had more money in their pockets, but simply because the administration decided to define poverty in a way that redefines reality. The administration cannot solve the nation's poverty problem by simply lowering the dollar amount that defines poverty and claim victory. Its efforts disregard the hardships that those experiencing poverty endure, and they ignore the growing body of evidence that show those in poverty face higher rates of inflation and therefore have less access to basic needs. The premise of the administration's proposal is that every customer has choices, such as the option to swap to a cheaper product when prices escalate. But those in poverty often don't face choices. Retail choices are limited. Food choices are limited. Convenience and proximity are limited in terms of access and transportation. Secondly, those in poverty spend most of their income on basic necessities already: medical care, housing, utilities. The cost of these basic needs have skyrocketed in comparison to the broader basket of goods assessed in the standard inflation rate. Let's give one example. The cost of rent in America, and in some parts of the country much higher, has gone up by 31% in the last 10 years. 31%. The existing inflation index rose by 17%, and if we use the administration's change CPI, it would have gone up only 14%. So rent, 31%. Inflation, where we peg poverty, 14%. A growing gap. Given the criticality and the flawed assumptions baked into the proposal, it's no surprise that OMB received over 57,000 comments and counting, most in opposition to lowering the inflation index for the official poverty measure. OMB's proposal failed to acknowledge that many government programs are administered using the poverty threshold and the huge impact it would have on children's access to vital programs. The administration's proposal to lower the poverty line ignores growing income inequality and, to me, misses the point entirely. The inadequacy of the existing poverty calculation is that it's too low, not that it's too high. In 2020, across all 48 contiguous states and the District of Columbia, the poverty threshold for a family of four is $26,200. Even in the poorest counties of our country, it's hard to imagine a family of four getting by on an annual income of $26,200. Just last year, the National Academy of Sciences released a report that found child poverty costs the nation between $800 billion and $1.1 trillion annually. The report also stated our nation could reduce poverty by 50% by simply increasing SNAP benefits, increasing housing vouchers, and expanding the social net. These actions would cost a lot less than that $1 trillion cost of doing nothing. I commend my colleague, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, on her legislation, Recognizing Poverty Act, that tackles the inadequacy of our current poverty measure by directing the Department of Health and Human Services and statistical agencies to propose a new poverty line that makes more sense. We're long overdue for a complete rewrite of a poverty threshold that was established over half a century ago. This bill requires the updated poverty line to factor in geographic cost variation, costs related to health insurance, work expenses, child care, and new necessities such as Internet access, all of which are excluded from the existing poverty measure. Hard to believe, but they are. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of Ms. Ocasio-Cortez's bill, and I hope many of my subcommittee colleagues will join in this effort. If there's one basic value that ought to unite us on this committee and in the Congress as Democrats and Republicans, it's how we treat our children. It doesn't matter where these children live or whose children they are. They're in our care. They're in our charge. They are America's children. With that, do you want to go first, or do you want me to call upon the chairman of the full committee?
Knowing that this is a political environment, I would certainly want you to call on the chairman of the full committee, and then I'll be glad to go.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows.
Well, I would say, Mr. Chairman, that it's not a political hearing. It's a very substantive and important one, and I think that the ranking member should go first, and I'll follow him.
With that, I call upon Mr. Meadows, the ranking
Well,
member.
I thank you both. Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing, and obviously this is a critical issue. I can tell you that in my district in western North Carolina, free and reduced lunches and a number of other issues that relate to poverty is still a present-day problem. And so I thank you for highlighting this particular issue. I thank both of my colleagues for being here today to address it from two different perspectives in two different states. So I thank you both. I would say this, one of the concerns I have is the premature nature of this hearing. The Trump administration has taken no action, and I would repeat, no action other than public comment. And there's two different buckets that we're looking at here. And the chairman knows that as it relates to other issues with regards to inflation, indexing, whatever you want to call it, I have a real concern when we look at the real inflation rate that not only those in poverty face, but our seniors face as well. Because sometimes the way the government calculates this is on the purchase of iPods and iPads, and I can tell you that a lot of times those that are affected the most, they're not making those kinds of purchases. They're purchasing food and rent and the basic necessities to stay really to live. And so I think it's important that we look at this. The public comment that we're facing here is looking at two different buckets. What should go into it? How should it be adjusted? And so as we look to move forward with this, what I would love to do is work in a bipartisan way to really address the real need of what we have here. There's no denying that the economy is growing, and in fact, just the other day, as I looked at economic numbers, and some would say, well, it's only the economic numbers for the very top percentage, but actually the increase in our economy has affected the bottom 10% more than it has any other group as the economy continues to go. And those are facts, those are statistics that the Department of Labor and certainly the economic advisors have, and yet, is there a real problem that we need to continue to address? The answer is certainly yes, and so with that, I would just ask that my entire written statement be made part of the record, and I would be glad to yield
Without
to the
objection, and I thank my friend, and I know he's committed to addressing issues of poverty. He and I worked together in a hearing on houseboats, and we both learned
And I thank you for that.
But we both learned the impact of banning houseboats on lower-income folks in your district, and I saw your commitment. So, of course, we'll be glad to work with you on a bipartisan basis, but we also want to highlight what could happen if the administration moves forward on its proposal. I now call on the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Ms. Maloney, for an opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and I thank you all for coming. And as chair of the Oversight and Reform Committee, I want first to thank my friend and colleague, Jerry Conley, for calling this very important hearing on the proposed recalculation of the poverty line. And I also would like to thank my friend and colleague from the great state of New York, Ocasio-Cortez, for her hard work and dedication and research on this issue. This is the first in a series of 4 hearings that we are going to hold over the next 2 days, today and tomorrow, on the negative effects on children of the Trump administration's poverty, housing, hunger, and health regulations. Put simply, the administration is engaged in an attack on children. Instead of creating economic opportunity and ensuring the health and well-being of our nation's children, this administration prioritizes special interests at their expense. It is our responsibility as a nation and as lawmakers in particular to protect all of our children from harm. We will not stand idly by as this administration implements policies and regulations that impede child development. Today, we examine the Office of Management and Budget's proposal to adopt an inflation rate that would purge thousands of children from eligibility in programs that promote growth and help them escape from poverty. The administration's efforts remove access to essential and proven services such as health care and nutrition assistance. I find it particularly disturbing that this administration fights for tax breaks for the more fortunate, while it seeks to take food literally from the mouths of hungry children by proposing to cut the SNAP program. This hearing will highlight how any change to the social safety net should do more, not less, to help America's children. I look forward to the testimony from both of my distinguished colleagues, and I yield back.
I thank the distinguished chair, and thank you so much for joining us again this morning. I now want to welcome our first panel, which will consist of our committee colleagues who will discuss ways to accurately measure poverty in the United States. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, who is the author of the bill I mentioned, and Congresswoman Carol Miller of West Virginia. Welcome to both of you. I thank my colleagues for their testimony, and without objection, both of you are welcome to join us in the dais and participate in the remainder of this hearing. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Connolly. I'm honored to be here today on behalf of my constituents in New York's 14th Congressional District. And I want to thank you and this entire subcommittee, as well as the committee at large, for participating in and leading in this week's historic hearings to examine the status of our nation's children. I'm testifying today not only as a member of Congress, but as a former child of a family in poverty, and who has family that continues to live in poverty. I am the daughter of a domestic worker. My mother cleaned houses growing up, and I grew up doing my homework on the stairs of other people's houses and on other people's kitchen tables, and reading in other people's living rooms as my mother scrubbed toilets and swept floors to make sure that we had a better life. I'm also the daughter of a young business owner. And my dad, at the age of 29, had me and started a business at a very young age. And growing up, we struggled a lot. Right around the time things started turning up better for my family, my father was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and he passed away when I was about 18 years old. Suddenly, I was the daughter of a single mom, and growing up, trying and striving as a first-generation family to be able to be the first on my family to go to college, to work and have the distinguished honor of interning for the late Senator Kennedy in that time, and then after graduating college, returning home to the Bronx, to my community, to try to make a difference, to see that these cycles of intergenerational poverty cannot be broken unless we take deep, strong, and systemic action. Oftentimes we hear and see a lot of, I believe, unnecessary, there's a lot of unnecessary, I would say, scandal that is kicked up around the poverty line. That recognizing poverty is some secret conspiracy to expand our social safety nets, because in a time of endless war and corporate giveaways, one of the biggest mistakes we can make, I suppose, is to help people too much. But I do believe that what we need to do is actually recognize the state of poverty in the United States. The current level of the poverty line is simply been calculated by the price of minimum dietary requirements times 3. The current poverty line assumes that you have a spouse at home full-time taking care of your children. The current poverty line assumes that you don't really have any significant health care costs. The current poverty line does not acknowledge geographic difference, which in a time when people complain and talk about how government does not understand the regional difference between urban, suburban, and rural communities, our poverty line treats all of these communities exactly the same. All of this is wrong. And even with that drastically mistaken number, even with that, By that calculation, today, 40 million Americans live in what the government recognizes as poverty. That's 1 in 10. 18.5 million Americans live in recognized extreme poverty, and 5.3 million Americans live in recognized absolute poverty. You know, that last year I spent a very long time putting together, along with our team and with other members, and yourself included, colleagues of Congress, with the Recognizing Poverty Act. And this asks the federal government to do a simple thing, to actually measure the amount of poor people in the United States of America. We do not do that. And as a consequence, America is in a state of denial about the level of poverty in this country. As a consequence of that, we do not truly understand the actual status of where people are. So as a consequence, the Recognizing Poverty Act requires the Secretary of Health and Human Services, in collaboration with the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, to work with the National Academy of Sciences to change the poverty line, adjusting for family size and geographic differences in the cost of goods and services. We must look at where our children live and what they need, because we cannot go another year with kids not getting food that they need, not losing parents because they can't afford health care. This is a moral wrong. And for children to lose their parents because they can't afford insulin or chemotherapy in what we proudly call the richest country in the world is a moral injustice and a moral outrage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. Representative Miller, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Connolly and Ranking Member Meadows. What an honor it is to be here in front of you today. I want to speak about the positive effects of the Trump economy in my home state of West Virginia. After years of overburdensome regulation, we are finally seeing incremental positive change in my state. Positive economic changes like this do not happen overnight, but it takes years to see, and I'm excited to see that that is happening in West Virginia. When it comes to poverty, we should always strive to do better. When we talk about poverty, we must also recognize how far we have passed from where we were 5 or 10 years ago. We must build upon this progress, not destroy it. It is innovation that has driven humankind forward. And as a farmer, I learned by myself the necessity is the mother of invention. It has improved our quality of life, it has extended our life expectancy, and it has made our society more healthy and vibrant. Innovation is the engine of our society's progress, and capitalism is the fuel that powers it. When West Virginia became a state, the quality of life was not nearly what it is today. There were no antibiotics, electricity, or running water in homes, no vaccines. And even if you lived in the top echelon of society, in 1863, your life expectancy was nearly half of what it is today. A century and a half ago, the richest person in the world would envy the standard of life that we are ensuring for every single American. That being said, only a few years ago in West Virginia, we experienced the darkest time in recent history. In 2009, President Obama's administration took drastic steps to wage war on the coal industry. In January of that year, there were 86,400 coal miners in the United States, and by the end of his administration, the number dropped all the way to 50,600. In 2009, West Virginia had 20,927 individuals employed in coal mining, and this number dropped to 16,000 by 2016. West Virginians have witnessed the devastating impacts of poorly thought out policy. Not only were thousands of coal miners out of work, but communities surrounding them struggled too. Machine shops, grocery stores, motels, clothing stores, all the surrounding businesses suffered. Sometimes they were shuttered completely as a result of disastrous policies. Small business and entrepreneurship are the heart and soul of our towns, and the war on coal collapsed these communities like dominoes. The devastation around the communities gave rise to great hopelessness, and when people experience despair, they'll turn to anything to numb their pain. In the case of West Virginia, we saw the devastating rise of the opioids. My state experienced 3 times the number of opioid overdose deaths than the national average. In 2016, the excitement of having a new leader, a businessman, and someone who understands economics helped breathe new life into West Virginia. Our unemployment rate is now at 5%, down over 3% from the height of the Obama administration, and over 374,000 people who were receiving SNAP benefits at that time. Since Trump's election, we've seen the number decrease by 315,000. This decrease means that more individuals have the opportunity to work and provide for their families. Thanks to the Tax Cuts and Job Act, we are seeing people across the country taking home more of their hard-earned money. Furthermore, the administration has drastically reduced these overburdensome regulations and made our country more business-friendly. The economy and the competition it has created has increased wages 5% annually for workers in West Virginia. It's hard to argue with the numbers. As I discussed earlier, innovation is crucial to move our country forward. The President has given businesses the opportunity to create new jobs and build life-saving solutions to further increase the quality of life. And certainly there are still many individuals and many families who are struggling, and we must continue to move forward and help them. But I must say that West Virginia is doing better. I've reviewed the notice for comment by the Office of Management and Budget, and I want to stay engaged with it. However, I think that this particular hearing is premature and will only instill fear into individuals and families. We should not be spreading falsities that the government is going to take away benefits, when in fact, that's not true. As we sit here today, we can disagree on the causes and we can disagree on the solution, but there is one thing I want to say before I finish. Every person in this room cares. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. My colleagues in both parties join me here today. They're good people who care about eliminating poverty in our society. Those in the administration and in the previous administration and in our states and local government. They're good people, and they care about eliminating poverty in our society. We can disagree on what helps and what hurts, but our goals are the same. I know that a strong economy is the best way to lift our neighbors and friends out of poverty. We must support an environment with stable tax policy where businesses can create jobs and good-paying wages and where competition helps spur innovation. The only thing that has ever lifted people out of poverty is opportunity and the desire to achieve more. Our goal must be to provide that path for every American to walk down. Thank you, Chairman Connolly.
Thank you. I will point out that you were comparing today to 1863. My seat that I hold in Virginia, we had 11 seats back then, and we lost my seat because of the secession of West Virginia. We didn't get it back till 1992. Just thought I'd mention that. Anyway, we want to thank you both so much for coming here today, and you're both welcome to join the panel for the hearing if you've got time. We will now call our second panel. As we're getting ready, let me introduce who's coming. Mr. Indi Dutta-Gupta, who is the co-executive director of the Center of Poverty at Georgetown Law School. Familiar face, Sister Simone Campbell, executive director of Network Lobby. Rob Smith, member of the President's Advisory Board of the Legacy Republican Alliance. And Amy Jo Hutchinson, who's an organizer for Healthy Kids and Families Coalition in West Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Amy Jo, I think you're sitting right there. Oh, you're there? Okay. All right. Sorry. So who's sitting in the middle? All right. Got it. If the four of you would rise and raise your right hand, we swear in our witnesses as a custom here in the committee. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record show that all of our witnesses answered in the affirmative. The microphones are sensitive, so if you pull them up close to you, that way we all hear you. Your full statement will be entered into the record, And so we encourage everybody to summarize their testimony as best they can, and each of you has 5 minutes in which to do so. We'll begin with you, Mr. Dudagupta.
Thank you, Chairman Connolly.
I forgot to say, you got to press the button to turn it on.
Thank you, Chairman Connolly, Ranking Member Meadows, and the members of the subcommittee and committee. My name is Indy Dudagupta, and I'm co-executive director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. I've worked on the issue of poverty measurement for over a decade, and I'm honored to speak before this subcommittee about the importance of an accurate poverty measurement for children, families, and society as a whole. Measuring and understanding economic hardship is essential to creating a society in which everyone has, at a minimum, a decent standard of living. Currently, we use the poverty measure in two crucial ways. First, it helps us paint a statistical picture of poverty to understand our economy's performance and reveal who experiences income deprivation, which is more common than many of us appreciate, yet varies substantially across people and place, in part because of serious social and economic barriers, such as discrimination in the labor and housing markets, segregation, systemic racism, and mass incarceration. Second, because policymakers have recognized how harmful poverty is in our country, they use the poverty measure for targeting resources, including through over 80 federal programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and the National School Lunch Program. These programs keep millions of people out of poverty and help boost wages, earnings, and educational and health outcomes, in turn advancing our nation's long-term prosperity. These two purposes require an accurate, thorough poverty measurement consistent with the lived experiences of income deprivation in the United States. Yet, as we heard from Representative Ocasio-Cortez, the official poverty measure is largely based on 1950s family arrangements and spending patterns, and a 1960s emergency food diet primarily updated for inflation over the past half-century. Today, these outdated assumptions have vast implications for hundreds of billions of dollars of funding for economic security and opportunity programs, and result in an overly optimistic picture of financial hardship in this country. So there's a strong case for new approaches to measuring poverty. Many alternative updates to the official poverty measure, including the supplemental poverty measure, the Census Bureau's preferred alternative measure, as well as public opinion, suggest that both the poverty thresholds and rates should be higher, not lower. The Trump administration is considering a proposal that would change the inflation index used to update the official poverty measure to the Changed Consumer Price Index, which grows more slowly than the currently used inflation index. The proposed change is technically questionable, economically unwise, and morally troubling. While the Changed Consumer Price Index may measure average inflation across the whole economy with some accuracy, it is not intended to be an accurate measure for people with low incomes. But more importantly, updating a poverty measure only for inflation, regardless of the inflation index, at best acts to freeze in time living standards, which is inappropriate for measuring income deprivation. Economist and philosopher Adam Smith observed that while a linen shirt was considered a luxury in the past, lacking one indicated poverty in much of the late 18th century Europe. Centuries later, and an ocean away, in 1964, and in these very buildings, Republican members of the Joint Economic Committee wrote, "In America, as our standard of living rises, so does our idea of what is substandard." I couldn't agree more. The administration's proposal would gradually shrink the already low federal poverty line relative to its current trajectory. In turn, fewer people would be eligible for foundational support programs as the proposal's effects compound over time. Hundreds of thousands of children would lose access to programs like Medicaid and SNAP, which improve kids' health when they become adults and increase their educational attainment, including high school graduation rates. Programs like WIC, which reduce infant mortality and improve birth outcomes, would also see declines in participation. This is a crucial conversation for our country. Poverty lines should always be connected to our living standards. Our current method of measuring poverty falls short, but the administration's proposal arbitrarily singles out and dubiously adjusts one aspect of the poverty measure without accounting for the broader ramifications to the measure's usefulness, relevance, and accuracy. This change would move the overall measure in the wrong direction. Instead, changes to poverty measurement should be considered carefully through significant research and consultation with experts, including people with lived experience with poverty. As someone who immigrated to this country with my family carrying $80 and having a place to stay, I'll say this: this seemingly technical change poses enormous dangers to families struggling against structural barriers to their own prosperity. And as a researcher who's worked on this issue for years, I'll say this: this change poses very real dangers to our nation's prosperity as well. Thank you. I look forward to taking questions.
Thank you. Perfectly timed. Sister Campbell, welcome back. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Conley and Ranking Member Meadows. It's an honor for me to appear here for our organization, Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. I'm honored to address this critical issue of what is happening, how do we determine poverty, and what do we use to assess it into the future. Today's hearing is examining this impact on children of a proposed regulation modifying the calculation of the Consumer Price Index. The two topics of chained CPI and children might seem totally disconnected, but I'm here to tell you that they are integrally connected and not in a good way. Chained CPI is based on the upper-class experience of comparison shopping and buying in bulk. If we apply the experience of the wealthy to low-income families, we deny struggling families their experience, exacerbate their poverty, and thus hurt their children. By reducing the CPI over time, it will push parents and their children off critical life-saving programs, which has been the design of the current administration. At Network, on our various Nuns on the Bus campaigns, we've traveled the country listening to people's experience and lifting up federal policies that can make a difference in their lives. Additionally, in 2019, our organization held 17 roundtables in rural communities in 16 states. So that you can have some sense of the breadth of our travel, I invite you to look at our map of the states where we have been color-coded, in either on the bus or in our 2019 series of rural roundtables. While we've missed the Northwest, as you can tell, on our major trips, we have developed a sense of the economic reality in both urban and rural settings. What we found in rural communities is that the people have no options for shopping. In Tutwiler, Mississippi, we saw that there was only the Dollar General store on the outskirts of town, and it had no fresh fruits or vegetables. If you wanted something else to eat, there was only, quote, gas station chicken, prepared by the gas station owners, and there were no options, no choices. There were also no restaurants or fast food outlets. Outside Tiffin, Ohio, the story was the same. The rural residents referred to their Dollar General as the shopping mall, because it carried a bit of everything and was their only option. In rural Northern California, we learned that the tribal casino was beginning to stock food items in their souvenir store because the casino bus was the only bus transportation in several county-wide area. People without cars were depending on the bus. It was the only way for many families to get to any form of a store. And these rural residents had no store, no choice, no opportunity. Chained CPI's major premise of options does not exist for wide swaths of our people. This results in families having to pay the single price offered. There's no capacity to shop for lower prices. There's also no capacity to, quote, buy in bulk because there's no extra money available for the added bulk cost. And there's no room available in cramped rental spaces to store the products, and often no convenient transportation to haul bulky items home. Additionally, in urban settings as well as rural, low-income families are already stretched thin. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I met Billy and his wife and two boys, aged 14 and 6. Billy told me that he and his wife are employed, but their rent and utilities take their entire salaries. Billy said living in the car was not an option for the boys, so they consolidate their wages for rent, use SNAP benefits for the boys during the day, and go to St. Benedict the Moor dining room in the evening for a free supper. Billy said it was okay for a parent to eat once, maybe twice a day, but growing children need more than that. This truth was emphasized by his 14-year-old son eyeing his dad's roll sitting uneaten on Billy's plate. Billy felt his son's desire without even looking at him. He just said, okay, go ahead, you can have it. And this hungry 14-year-old pounced on the roll. If there is any reduction in SNAP benefits for this hardworking family, Billy's kids will suffer. the same fate as their parents, and they will not be able to eat 3 meals a day. As a Catholic sister, I value the moral framework set by my faith. At World Youth Day in 2013, Pope Francis said, "The measure of the greatness of a society is found in the way it treats those most in need, those who have nothing apart from their poverty." So my prayer for you, as you look at this critical issue, is may our wealthy nation recover its moral and constitutional compass and invest in our children and their families. This will be a step towards realizing our constitutional commitment for we the people to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
Thank you, Sister Campbell. Mr. Smith.
Good morning, Honorable Chair, Ranking Member, and honorable members of this committee. My name is Rob Smith. I'm a U.S. Army veteran and a proud Black conservative. I grew up in the working class community of Akron, Ohio, and was raised by a single mother who was, yes, on government assistance for a small point in time when I was very young after my mother and father divorced. Although we didn't have much money or access to a whole lot of resources, she worked very hard to provide for her children. Like many who grew up in Akron, Ohio, I attended some of the lowest performing and underfunded schools in the neighborhood. Disaffected teachers would routinely come to class unprepared, and my counselors had little idea of what to do with a student who quite obviously didn't have an athletic scholarship ready and available for him upon graduation. What we did have in our poor working class neighborhood, however, was a strong sense of community and an undying belief in self. The figureheads, parents, and activists of my day always spoke positively of a brighter future, one where they'd have successfully passed on the torch of leadership and hope of opportunity to us so that we could pave the way for additional successes, just like our forefathers and mothers had done for us. That undying belief in the ability for us as human beings, each of us all endowed with great gifts, to continuously improve and better our circumstances in the world around us is what drove me to better myself and to serve my country. I graduated from high school near the top of my class and decided to serve my country as an infantryman in the United States Army, including a deployment to both Kuwait and Iraq. I credit the time that I spent in the Army with building the unshakable belief that I have in myself that I am not a victim, that there is nothing that I cannot achieve, and that I am in the best place I could possibly be in to do this, which is the United States of America. I joined the military because I love my country and because it offered a working class kid like me the opportunity to see the world far beyond the confines of Akron, Ohio. It offered me the American dream. Today, I'm a political analyst who has provided commentary on several major news networks, including CNN and Fox News. I have met the last 2 presidents of the United States. I have met ambassadors, congressmen and women, and senators. I advocate for veterans' rights. I protested for the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law that barred service for military members who were openly lesbian, gay, or bisexual. I am the first person in the history of my family to receive my bachelor's degree from Syracuse University and also my master's degree from Columbia University. I'm now a contributor to several reputable online resources and will publish my memoir in May. I'm living a life far beyond what my high school education and upbringing would have suggested, and I wouldn't have been able to accomplish any of these things had my mentality and beliefs about self been any different. If I had succumbed to the soft bigotry of low expectations, or to any of the rhetoric from elected officials who wish to substitute the role that strong individuals and communities play in supporting each other with that of an all-powerful, unaccountable, and bloated government, where would I be today? Granted, it wasn't until I started to reject the messages that seek to take control and responsibility out of the hands of the individual and put that into the government that I saw my greatest personal and career successes. Just a few decades ago, such an existence would have been infeasible in the communities where I come from. No one wants their lives dictated by the government. It is the exact antithesis of the values that have and continue to make our country great. Yes, I have family members who remain on government assistance. I have seen firsthand how the government can easily take on the role of father in the household and the destruction and dysfunction that that can cause. After a long and steady drumbeat by this latest flock of so-called progressives, people have unfortunately come to believe that more government may actually be a solution to their problems. A casual glance at the economy under President Trump suggests otherwise. Since his first days in office, the president has worked to unlock the economy by removing regulatory burdens from small business owners and entrepreneurs so that they can continue to innovate in the diverse communities where they live, work, and play. I have seen Black small business owners that I myself patronize thrive in this economy. Objectively, we can see the results. We can see poverty on the decline, the Black unemployment rate at the lowest it's been in recorded history, and the stock market has experienced an unprecedented rally that's undoubtedly been good for the retirements of working-class American families. The proof is right in front of us for all to see. Even those who advocate for socialism continue to reap the benefits of the greatest economy this generation has seen.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you.
Ms. Hutchinson.
Good morning. My name is Amy Jo Hutchison. I'm a single mom of two who's lived in West Virginia all my life. I'm also a community organizer for West Virginia Healthy Kids and Families, Our Future West Virginia, where I organize and advocate for poor and marginalized folks. Today I'm here to help you better understand poverty because poverty is my lived experience. And I'm also here to acknowledge the biased beliefs that poor people are lazy and that poverty is their fault. But how do I make you understand things like working full-time for $10 an hour is only about $19,000 a year, even though it's well above the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour? I want to tell you about a single mom I met who was working at a gas station. She was promoted to manager, and within 30 days, she had to report her new income to DHHR. Within 60 days, her rent bumped from $475 to $950 a month. She lost her SNAP benefits and her family's health insurance. So she did what poor people are forced to do all the time. She resigned her promotion and went back to working part-time just so she and her family could survive. Another single mom I know encouraged her kids to get jobs. For her DHR review, she had to claim their income as well. She lost her SNAP benefits and her insurance, so she weaned herself off of her blood pressure medicines because she, working full-time in a bank and part-time at a shop on the weekends, couldn't afford to buy them. Eventually, the girls quit their jobs because their part-time fast food income was literally killing their mother. You see, the thing is, children aren't going to escape poverty as long as they're relying on a head of household, who was poor. Poverty rolls off the backs of parents and right onto the shoulders of our children, despite how hard we try. I can tell you about my own with food insecurity. The nights I went to bed hungry so my kids could have seconds, and I was employed full-time as a Head Start teacher. I can tell you about being above the poverty guideline, nursing my gallbladder with essential oils and prayer, chewing on cloves and eating ibuprofen like they're Tic Tacs because I don't have health insurance and I can't afford a dentist. I have 2 jobs and a bachelor's degree, and I struggle to make ends meet. The federal poverty guidelines say that I'm not poor, but I cashed in a jar full of change the other night so my daughter could attend a high school band competition with her band. I can't go grocery shopping without a calculator. I had to decide which bills not to pay to be here in this room today. Believe me, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps so many damn times that I've ripped them off. The current poverty guidelines are ridiculously out of touch. The poverty line for a family of 3 is $21,720. Where I live, because of the oil and gas boom, a 3-bedroom home rents for $1,200 a month. So if I made $22,000 a year, which could disqualify me from assistance, I would have $8,000 left to raise 2 children and myself on. And yet the poverty guidelines wouldn't classify me as poor. I Googled congressman's salary the other day, and according to Senate.gov, the salary for senators, representatives, and delegates is $174,000 a year. So a year of work for you is the equivalent of almost 4 years of work for me, and I'm $24,000 above the federal poverty guidelines definition of poor. It would take 9 people working full-time for a year at $10 an hour to match y'all's salary. I also read that each senator has authorized $40,000 for state office furniture and furnishings, and this amount is increased each year to reflect inflation. That $40,000 a year for furniture is $360 more than the federal poverty guidelines for a family of 7. And yet here I am, begging you on behalf of the 15 million children living in poverty in the United States, on behalf of the 1 in 3 kids under the age of 5, and nearly 100,000 children in my state of West Virginia living in poverty, to not change anything about these federal poverty guidelines until you can make them relevant and reflect what poverty really looks like today. You have a $40,000 furniture allotment. West Virginia has a median income of $43,000 and some change. People are working full-time and are hungry. Kids are about to be kicked off the free and reduced lunch rolls because of changes y'all want to make to SNAP. Even though 62% of West Virginia's SNAP recipients are families with children, the very same children who cannot take a part-time job because their parents will die without insurance. People are working full-time in this country for very little money. They're not poor enough to get help. They don't make enough to get by. They're working while they're rationing their insulin, and they're skipping their meds because they can't afford food and health care at the same time. So shame on you. Shame on you, and shame on me, and shame on each and every one of us who haven't rattled the windows of these buildings with cries of outrage at a government that thinks their office furniture is worthy of $40,000 a year and families and children aren't. I'm not asking you to apologize for your privilege, but I'm asking you to see past it. There are 46 million Americans living in poverty, doing the best they know how with what they have, and we, in defense of children and families, cannot accept anything less from our very own government. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you.
I think we just heard why this hearing is important. I call on the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's important hearing examines how this administration is seeking to further distort what it means to live in poverty in the United States by adopting an inflation index that ignores true costs. We will also examine how the current official poverty measure inadequately addresses the needs of families with low incomes, as we've heard from some of our witnesses. This proposal, one of many efforts by the administration that could hurt children and families across this country who are living in poverty, policies that fail to help those in need and, in fact, continue poverty. Ms. Hutchinson, you work in West Virginia with low-income moms, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you have likely heard claims that because of the stock market and economy are doing well, all Americans must be benefiting from these economic gains. So my question is, are you benefiting from these economic gains? Are the women and families that you work with benefiting from the economic gains?
My answer to that, ma'am, would be no. West Virginia is one of the handful of states here in the nation whose poverty rate has steadily increased over the course of the past 2 years.
Ms. Hutchinson, what are some of the ways that life in poverty continues and impedes a child's future opportunities? How does it stop future opportunities living in poverty?
I'm pretty emotional right now, so I want to apologize for that right off the bat. There is a toxic stress that comes with being poor. And it affects me, I pray, a lot more than it does my girls. You don't know what it's like to not be able to feed your kid what the neighbor kids are eating. That's why we have Title I programming, right? Because they have extra needs and extra requirements for those kids in poverty. You know, we all know that it affects the first 1,000 days of a child's life have been proven to be the most important as far as brain development. And if we can't nurture these kids, if we keep gutting the systems and crippling their mothers, then we're never going to be able to see any improvement as far as children, whether that's social, emotional development. You know, we also have a child care crisis in West Virginia. So these kids aren't getting the early education that they require. But we're not working and focusing on brain development because that's so closely related to nutrition and economic, socioeconomic status that we have to start paying attention to that.
Thank you. Sister Campbell, your organization works nationwide to promote justice and dignity for all. How would the administration's proposal to adjust the inflation index for the poverty threshold affect the families with whom you work?
Congresswoman, I am keenly aware that this proposal would undercut the very tenuous hold that families have on stability. I want to underscore that these families are not victims. These families are not subject to takeover by government. What they are subject to, however, principally is low wages, low economic opportunity. There are alternatives to SNAP benefits, would be raising wages. If we raised wages in a significant fashion, that would dramatically reduce the need for SNAP benefits. But in my view, working families deserve to eat, and when their wages and hours don't match the current costs, well, then we as a nation have a responsibility to care for them.
Thank you. Mr. Duda Gupta, you have researched poverty and inequality across our nation. Could you summarize for some of us your key findings that detail the harms that families are suffering as a result of the actions of this administration? Specifically, how are current policies continuing inequality and deepening inequality in our nation?
Thank you, Congresswoman Maloney, for the question. First, we have seen, despite continued economic growth, for the first time since the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, an actual decline in health coverage for children, which is really astonishing. And that's because of some of the sabotage and efforts to attack that health coverage options. And then we've seen tax cuts that obviously wildly disproportionately go to the very wealthiest and enrich people who least need it, while people who have the low and moderate incomes got very, very little, if anything.
Thank you. My time has expired. I'd like to send you future questions in writing, and thank you for your testimony,
I thank the chair.
all of your testimony.
Chair now calls on Mr. Comer from Kentucky for 5 minutes.
Chairman, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. My questions are for Mr. Smith. We're talking about the poverty line here today, and the poverty line is determining eligibility for certain welfare payments and welfare programs. So I think it's pertinent to discuss the welfare system and whether or not it's working. You know, I've always believed that the best way to get people out of poverty is not necessarily through government programs, but through creating an environment where those living in poverty have access to a good paying job. And if you look at the macro environment today, we have a very strong economy. Now, I represent a lot of areas of excessive poverty, and I will admit there are communities in Kentucky and in America that haven't benefited as well as others. But regardless of what community where I travel in Kentucky, there are an enormous number of jobs available in every community right now. The unemployment rate is the lowest it's been in my lifetime. And I don't know, I represent 30 counties in Kentucky. I don't know of a single county that doesn't have at least 50 to 100 jobs posted. Some counties have thousands of jobs posted online. So my question, Mr. Smith, with reference to the welfare system, is the welfare system today working for people in poverty?
It is not of my opinion that the welfare system today is working for people in poverty. My experience in welfare, like I testified, I have family members that are on government assistance. My mother was on government assistance when I was younger. My experience from what I've seen with my own two eyes, I'm not somebody that studies this and works in it in some big overarching way. What I've seen with my own two eyes is people become dependent on a system. What I have seen is people figure out ways that they can use a system. And what I see is that fundamentally, when people are within the system, what I have seen for years and years and years and years, it's almost like it takes away their ability to see anything more for themselves and to see a better life for themselves, because they are so used to being what I call the surrogate father, Uncle Sam. That is what I've seen with my own two eyes. Now, I know that people may have different experiences. Right. I'm not here to testify about anybody else's experiences. I'm here to tell you what I've seen with my own two eyes. And as somebody that is an African American in the society, there are so many messages that are pushed to us that we need government assistance, that we need help, that we are weak, that we are victims, that we cannot create, that we cannot do things for ourselves. And I feel like the welfare system as it stands right now is a part of those messages that we get. And I am aware that there are more whites than blacks in America, and I am aware that there are more white people on government assistance than black people. But what I see is the primary messages that are given about the welfare system, about government assistance, are being directed towards African Americans.
Okay. One of the complaints I hear from both employers desperately trying to find more workers, as well as people who are living right there on the poverty line, is that many times it's more advantageous to remain on welfare than to take that leap of faith and go into the workforce. I believe that what we should be talking about is trying to come up with bridge programs to get people from welfare to the workforce. And we have to recognize the fact that minimum wage isn't a living wage. Having said that, I don't think it's government's responsibility to determine the minimum wage. I think if you want to start a business and you can find employees willing to work for minimum wage, I think that's your prerogative. But I do have a problem in states like Kentucky where we give tax credits and tax incentives and grants to companies that don't pay a living wage. I think that's the way to address the wage issue. I don't think we need to set minimum wages in Congress for the private sector, but I do believe we need to reevaluate our tax incentives as far as awarding to companies that don't pay a living wage. So I hope that we can take this committee hearing and look at ways to get people that are able-bodied from welfare out of this cycle, this never-ending cycle of welfare that's not work. It's not work.
Thank you.
We need to get them into the workforce, and that's what we need to focus on today, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel for your testimony. I appreciate you coming today. I want to salute my colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for her legislation on recognizing poverty. And this question of whether we even see poverty in the ways that we should as lawmakers and political leaders in this country, I think, is a persistent one. I remember when I went to the funeral for Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and Elijah Cummings, former chair of our full committee here, gave one of the eulogies, and he said, "Did you see him? Did you see him when he was alive?" I mean, there were thousands of people in the church that day, but Congressman Cummings wanted to know, when he was alive, did we see Freddie Gray? Did we see him? And I think the answer is we often don't see people in poverty in this country in a way that motivates us to do the right thing and to put the policies in place. Too often the people we see are the people who have the power to get access to us and show up in our offices because they are entitled. They can get the meetings, and then the policy gets made on their behalf. We have to fix that. The moral integrity of a nation can be measured by how we deal with poverty. And by that measure, we're failing every single day in this country. It's incredible in the richest nation on earth that so many people suffer in poverty and often suffer in silence. So I want to thank the whole panel. I want to thank you, Sister Campbell, for the work of Network, the Faithful Democracy Initiative, where you are connecting the dots for us in terms of how money and influence determines policy when it comes to economic equality, or let's call it inequality, in this country, where Wall Street decides what we should focus on, and the people that are left out and locked out don't have their priorities being met. You know, I went back and found a quotation from Bob Dole, Republican senator, 1983. Here's what he said. He said, when these political action committees give money, they expect something in return other than good government. So he was talking about the tie between how lobbyists spend their money and special interests spend their money and the policy that gets made, and it's not what good government should do. But then he went on to say this, very poignant. He said, poor people don't make political contributions. You might get a different result if there were a poor PAC up here in Washington. That's Bob Dole talking about the reality of how money influences policy and the impact it has in terms of our ability to address poverty in this country. So, Sister Campbell, maybe you could just give me your thoughts. I expect you probably have some perspective on this, given the great work that Network is doing to try to expose that connection between money and policy that leaves people who are suffering in poverty out of the equation. So I invite you to give me your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to connect it to what Congressman Comer was saying, because I was recently in Kentucky. I was also in West Virginia, but I was recently in Kentucky in the eastern part in Congressman Rogers' district, and they have many signs there for help wanted. And the fact is they're all minimum wage jobs, and people can't survive on these minimum wage jobs. So the roundtable we had, Mickey McCoy, who's a high school teacher, almost was in tears at the end when he said the thing that he wanted most, just wanted most, was for his representatives to actually represent him, just to meet with him just once and hear his actual story, instead of only speaking to Big Coal. And I think that is the tension in our democracy right now. And it goes to many of the issues that you've been working on, Congressman Sarbanes, on the issues of access to voting and making sure that we have an actual democracy. But the key is, if you don't talk to ordinary people working minimum wage jobs, working in the schools, working in the various service sectors, then you're going to come away with your preconceptions that have been nourished by the ones you do talk to, who are the folks at the top, who then benefit from tax policy. It's a serious problem.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman for Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today and for this hearing. Mr. Smith, I do want to go to you. We, as I'm sure each of you know, we spend a little over $1 trillion a year in welfare programs, over 90 different programs between federal, state, and local. And yet, even with this $1 trillion a year, there's 12% of Americans remain in poverty. So I do think, and I'd like to piggyback some on Mr. Comer's line of thought and questions as well. I do think it is pertinent for us to have a discussion about the welfare system and whether or not it works. Obviously, what all of us want is to see people come off of poverty. And in spite of spending $1 trillion a year, we still have 12% in poverty. So the question that I want to begin with you is, do you think welfare programs as they currently exist are helping to alleviate poverty?
I do not believe that welfare systems as they stand are helping to alleviate poverty, because I think that we're not talking a lot about personal responsibility and decisions that sometimes people may make that can put them into poverty. Case in point, and there is not a single woman in my family who made it to 21 years old without having a child. Every woman in my family who had a child before that age also had a child and was unmarried. And I think that these things really do factor into whether people will live in poverty. And I feel like the welfare system as it stands right now is it's supposed to be a governmental solution to a problem that starts with different choices. And I think that if the programs keep on expanding and expanding and expanding, we're not taking into account the choices. And we're not talking about the fact that personal responsibility is going to have some sort of effect as to whether or not people live in poverty. Now, I told you my story earlier when I testified, and I'm a bootstrapper through and through. I grew up working class, poor. I made the decision at 17 years old to join the United States Army. The United States Army is where I learned discipline. The United States Army is where I learned how to take care of myself. The United States Army is where I learned all of the things that I believe that this government intervention, that these welfare programs are trying to imbue in the households without having to be there. That is what I truly fundamentally believe. I realize that that is not a popular position to take, not only in this chambers, but in American society. But it is what I believe because it has been my personal experience.
Well, and the studies that I've read and through all of this, you're spot on in identifying it's a complex issue. But from my research, the three key issues and factors to get out of poverty include family, education, strong education, and economic opportunity. Those three things have to be available for all this. So it's a multifaceted issue that we've got to discuss. Here, primarily, today we're talking about the welfare programs primarily themselves. So if the welfare programs as they currently exist are not ultimately helping to alleviate poverty, then we must secondly ask, what does alleviate poverty? You've mentioned family, we've mentioned need education, kids graduating from high school, and so forth. But on the welfare side of things, the economy is critical so that people can have the opportunities, as Mr. Comer was saying, to get a high-paying job.
Absolutely.
So what is the role of the economy in alleviating poverty?
The role of the economy, I mean, we have a very strong economy right now, and what I wanted to say as well is that we don't realize how many more people are working right now. I am nowhere near the 1%, and this economy has benefited me via the tax breaks that I got when I did taxes with my husband. It helps in a lot of different ways, and I think that when there is more opportunity for people out there, you have Detroit right now. I read a story from NPR in Detroit. There are prisoners that were released for nonviolent offenses under the First Step Act, which was passed by this administration. These are men and women who served 10, 15, 20 years. There are now so many jobs that people that are employers are rethinking their stance on hiring people that were previous offenders. And there are so many jobs open for them right now. So I think that the economy really does have a very strong part in lifting people out of poverty. I really do.
I thank the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes himself. The idea that someone is poor because they made bad choices or they embrace poverty as a choice is a very convenient way of ignoring reality. People are born into circumstances. People are born into circumstances they don't control. No child chooses poverty. This kind of rhetoric is a leftover from the Calvinist idea of predestination and the elect. It's your fault you're poor. What's wrong with you? Yes, we have a full employment economy. I have lots of jobs in my district that are open. All of them require a graduate degree and a security clearance. You got one? We're not going to employ the people who have to find work at below minimum wage, pumping gas, or flipping hamburgers behind a fast food desk. And oh, by the way, this myth that this is welfare dependence, and if only you broke that cycle, you wouldn't be poor. Have the courage to make the right decision. The fact of the matter is, the data shows that since we actually adopted programs from the Great Society, we did reduce the poverty level. We did help people with a hand up to actually get out of poverty, to give kids an opportunity. I started my opening statement by remembering Robert Kennedy's visit to Mississippi Delta. This country did not see poverty. It was shocked. When those images were on television and we saw distended bellies in our country, we were shocked into action. No kid made that decision. No parent made that decision. I'm glad there's occasion where somebody apparently bootstraps himself up successfully. But not everybody has that opportunity. And that isn't the story for lots of people, and it's not their fault. We're having a hearing today about the impact of a changed CPI at the margins on people who are already living in the margins. This is a test about who we are as a people. This is a test about whether we're willing to invest in our kids and their parents and guardians in the richest country in the world. To live with such poverty, and oh, by the way, to add to the stigma of blame like it's their fault, is not worthy of a great country. It's not who we ought to be. Ms. Hutchinson, I want to give you a chance because we heard earlier testimony that actually things are a lot better in West Virginia since West Virginia became a state in 1863. I'm very glad to hear that news.
They got that one right.
Although we're still a little bitter in Virginia, but I'll let that go. And the other thing is, whatever problems we got pretty much are due to a war on coal. So your circumstances and that of your family, your understanding is that's based on the war on coal?
I don't have a coal miner in my family, sir.
Oh, maybe you want to, maybe you'd like to react to some of the testimony we heard about your state.
Yeah, and you know, in the state of West Virginia, in 2019, it was reported that 2 in every 5 children are on SNAP. 2 in every 5. I have 2 children myself, and there are 3 kids that live next door. So my 2 kids used to be on SNAP. One thing that I do want to say is that I have been told for 15 years to stop having kids I couldn't afford. That's a child support issue, and that's an accountability issue for the other parent who's not supporting their child, not this one. I'm sorry, but I wanted to say that out loud. There are 349,423 West Virginians that rely on SNAP every month. And we were talking this morning. I said, I know a lot of poor people. That's my job. I organize poor folks. I don't know a welfare queen. We are resilient. We were talking about how hard it is to get to D.C. when you're poor and you don't have a credit card, right? That was my thing. I don't have a credit card. And I don't know if y'all know, you can't manipulate your way through D.C. without a credit card. You know, and so we were talking about the barriers, buying new clothes, feeling like you don't belong.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchinson. My time is up. The chair recognizes, well, actually, Mr. Massey, I think, is next. Mr. Grothman, up to you how you want to go. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You and I have something in common. We worked in local government before, and when I was a county judge executive, which is kind of like the mayor of a county, one of the problems that was presented to me that we had to solve was we had a country store that wanted to be able to take WIC, but they didn't have internet access that would enable them to process that. So there are some barriers that are still out there, and some of those are unique to rural areas. I'm from Kentucky myself. I asked the local grocer like what percent of your sales are SNAP, and I was actually shocked. It was like 30 or 40%. So with recognizing that this is an important issue and that a lot of people depend on the social safety net, I would like to remind folks that our goal is not to expand the social safety net so much as it is to try and help people use that net, but to get them back off of the net. And so I wanted to talk about some of the things that the President highlighted in his State of the Union last night, and I would like to submit the State of the Union speech, transcript of that for the record, if I may.
Without objection, and the chair will also add the Democratic responses to the speech last night for the record.
Without objection. So the President highlighted, and I'll draw these directly from his speech, one of the things he highlighted is that since his election, we've created 7 million new jobs, 5 million more than experts projected during previous administration. The unemployment rate is at the lowest in over half a century. The average unemployment rate under this administration is lower than any administration in the history of our country. The unemployment rates for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans have reached the lowest levels in history. African American youth unemployment has reached an all-time low. African American poverty has declined to the lowest rate ever recorded. The unemployment rate for women has reached the lowest level in almost 70 years. Last year, women filled 72% of all new jobs added. Veterans unemployment rate dropped to a record new low, and I think that's something where we also really need to focus on when people come back from serving our country, making sure that there is a path for them to become gainfully employed. Unemployment rate for disabled Americans has reached an all-time low. I think that's another area where we need to focus. Workers without a high school diploma, and I know people that had to quit high school because their family needed them to be employed. Workers without a high school diploma have achieved the lowest unemployment rate recorded in U.S. history. And getting that diploma also is something that we need to focus on too, because that's a barrier to the job market. Record number of young Americans are now employed. And also, I wanted to say that under this administration, and I know this is somewhat controversial, but I don't think it should be, 7 million Americans have come off the food stamp rolls, and 10 million people have been lifted off of welfare. I think that's an important thing to look at that metric, while still understanding that we need that social safety net for some of those people. But the goal ultimately is to help them so that they don't need it. And in just 3 years of the current administration, 3.5 million working age people have joined the workforce. So these are all things that I think are worth highlighting that were in the State of the Union address, because we're talking about poverty here today and how to deal with it. And ultimately, the best thing we can do is not expand the number of people who are in poverty, but to pull up as many people as we can out of poverty. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from the U.S. Virgin Islands is recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for having this hearing and for the importance of the discussion of poverty in the United States. You know, I'm reflecting on the fact that I heard so much I and me, and I hear so much I and me in bootstrap stories, which really just go against the whole Christian notion of thinking outside of yourself. It disturbs me. But then when I also hear discussions of women and choices that they make, that also explains a lot of the I and me. As someone who had my first child at 21, and 3 before I left law school, I don't see the issue with that. I have a journalist, an architect, and an engineer out of those children. Discussions that we cannot take care of ourselves, and that the community doesn't, negates what makes this country so great. And as for the speech last night, 14 million jobs were added in the last administration, far more than this administration. The unemployment rate dropped from 10 to 5% in the last administration. Only 2 percentage points have changed in this administration. And when we take 10 million people off of welfare, what is the cost to us, actually? If you don't even want to talk about the social costs, that doesn't move you. What's the financial cost in the long run of doing something like that? Dr. Gupta, removing children from welfare, healthcare access, will removing that reduce the federal deficit, and does it shrink the federal budget?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Look, programs like Medicaid and CHIP, all the programs we're talking about, SNAP, WIC, they provide a fundamental basic foundation for all families, for all kids who participate. The research is overwhelming that these programs, when you look at the next generation, so the kids who participate, will do better in school. If we want more high school graduation, Medicaid and SNAP help with that. We know that. The kids will be healthier, fewer chronic health conditions that will be less costly to our society. And by the way, when we hear a figure like $1 trillion being spent a year, a lot of that is a wildly inefficient healthcare system. The money's not going to low-income families. It's going to the providers, the doctors, the nurses, and the people who run diagnostics and equipment. It's not going directly to the families, a lot of that money. So one of the worst things we could do is reduce access to programs like Medicaid and CHIP and SNAP. I have yet to see research that suggests any of these programs that we're talking about has nothing but positive effects for that second generation, probably by helping address the toxic stress that Ms. Hutchison talked about, by allowing parents to spend more time with their kids. And the final thing I just note is...
But you know, those are arguments that don't necessarily sway people as to the bottom line. I'm talking about the financials, because for many of us in this room, that's what's important.
They'll earn more. Kids who are exposed to Medicaid and SNAP and other programs are likely to earn more as adults, to be employed more as adults, to pay more taxes. There's increasing evidence that some of these programs may even pay for themselves, like housing assistance programs, child care, programs we don't have, like paid family and medical leave. So we should really think about what happens over the long term, and I think you're exactly right that we're going to see greater tax receipts, we're going to see greater economic output, and our economy is going to prosper much more.
So it's an investment we're making as Americans. Sister Campbell, thank you so much for the work that you're doing in your community. How are low-income families particularly vulnerable to increasing health care costs?
Low-income families are stretched thin in attempting to respond to the healthcare needs. The holes in our system, if you do not qualify for Medicaid or you're in a state which has not expanded Medicaid, means that your kids are vulnerable. In Mississippi, at our Rural Roundtable, we heard the story about how kids sign up for sports in the high school because they can get a free health care screening in advance of playing the sports, which they cannot get on their own in their family. This is a level of desperation that needs to be addressed. Our kids are suffering.
Thank you so much. You know, I just think about, just as closing, in the Virgin Islands, the federal government has determined that we're not entirely American citizens. And so our Medicaid costs and the things that we receive are at a much lower level than other places. Therefore, our local government's economy is strained. When parents have to make the choice of not having health insurance, not having Medicare, because we can't afford to put them on there because the percentages are too high for us, in the end, it costs us more because of the illnesses that those children have, because of the strain on local government to meet the needs of those who have to go to our local hospitals to do so. So I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for her bill and the work that this committee is doing to address these issues. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Smith, thanks for being here. It takes kind of guts to show up in this sort of environment. Karl Marx, you know, obviously one of his goals was the abolition of the family. And the programs that began in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, well, there are plus and minuses to all the programs, be it SNAP, housing, TANF, Pell Grants, medical care. They all seem to share a discouragement of marriage, and you mentioned how in your family a lot of that was going on. Could you comment on the effect and the eligibility of these programs and kind of the decline of the family structure in America since the programs began?
Yes, I will do my best. First of all, I just wanted to say that, you know, there's definitely a lot of I and me in my story, but for me sitting here, the I and the me represents millions of Americans of all colors who have similar stories about how they were able to help themselves, about how they were able to lift themselves up out of poverty, about how they were able to believe in themselves enough to know that they could do better. And I just wanted to say that. Now, when you talk about the family structure, and you talk about how the welfare system has accelerated the decline of the family structure, you have to look at the rules that make it more beneficial for women not to have a man in the home, to not be married, right? And these things, when they go in generation and generation and in generation, and I've seen with my own two eyes, this create generational dependency, generational dysfunction, and when you get that deep into it, it gets harder and harder for people to get out of it. And the messages that say that it is the government's responsibility to take care of people. Like I said, there was a part of my speech I didn't get to, but basically, I agree with the president when he said that we can't just leave people on the streets. But the purpose of the safety net was never dependency, it was transition. So the arguments I constantly hear about these programs, that I constantly hear about the expansion of the safety net, is not about transitioning people off of it. It is always about keeping people on. And I do believe that it engenders a sort of mental idea with people.
Right. Can I cut you off? I love talking to immigrants. And one of the things I get when I talk to immigrants, cab drivers or whatever in this town, is they're living the American dream.
Absolutely.
They came here with broken English, you know, very little education, but they're living the American dream. And I wondered if one of the reasons you feel that why immigrants who come here from Afghanistan, Guatemala, wherever, are living the American dream, whereas Americans born here are not, is Americans born here, kind of from some of the other people in the room, get the message that ask the government, ask the government, ask the government. And people who come here from other countries who weren't brought up in that culture are living the American dream, have their own house, da-da-da-da-da, because they don't have that burden of being told you should look to the government.
Well, Congressman, I don't believe that it's a difference between people that were native-born and American and people that are immigrants. I believe that it's a difference in messaging that people get. If you are a kid from a working class or poor background or comes from poverty, like I have, and if you get messages over and over and over again that you cannot exist in this society, that you cannot make it, that this society is racist and is sexist and is xenophobic and it's homophobic and all of these different things, then if you take in those messages, you will not be motivated to succeed. I truly believe that the messages that we give to some of our poor and working class kids in this society is that you don't need to invent anything for yourself. You don't need to do anything for yourself because the government will do it. And I fundamentally believe that these messages are very damaging for the youth of America.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is people born in this country get those messages. People who just show up from Afghanistan or Guatemala might not breathe in those messages.
Yes.
So they form families and become part of the middle class.
Yes. And I just wanted to say, I've got 15 seconds left. If we take completely 100% the element of personal responsibility and personal choices out of where people end up in life, I don't think that that's a good thing.
Oh, it's just a horrible thing to say. Just horrible to say that you are entirely a victim. Yep.
I thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, Mr. Smith, you evoked a lot of me and I and bootstraps. I have a question for you. You talked about the women in your family making bad choices. Obviously, you feel because you have a lot of eyes that you were not a bad choice to be born. The women in your family, do you look at them as part of the problem? Did they make bad decisions? Because you said these women who had children, they made bad decisions. So are you saying that the culture you were brought in, that those women in your family are bad people, they're lazy, they don't respect the sense of your accomplishments? So when you come around, are you ostracized because you're not on welfare anymore? You told your me and I, and you're sending a strong message right now as a black man that black women are dysfunctional and they want to sit around and get welfare. So can you clear that up for me,
Congresswoman,
please?
I would love to, and I absolutely did not say that the women in my family were bad people.
They make bad choices.
I didn't say that they made bad choices either. Congresswoman, okay, all right, Congresswoman. Yeah, if I can answer the question. Congresswoman, what I would like to say is that there is no way that I can separate the fact that some of the women in my family who I love and deeply respect, and we have had this conversation amongst each other, and I've had this conversation with them. There's no way for me to separate the struggles that they have had in their lives with the fact that a lot of them did have children very early in life.
Okay, Mr. Smith, I want to ask this question.
Yes.
The fact that you were able to pull up yourself from bootstraps, you had no control over the decision that your parents or your mother made. But the fact that you received food stamps so that you can eat, so that you could develop, so that you could have a brain, there is a contribution that happened in your life that we have to take beyond you. There are children in America who are hungry. And we, as a country that sends billions of dollars to other countries to feed hungry children, how can we in this country, so that we can produce men like you, children who can grow up, and for whatever reason that their mother made, and I want you to know, any woman who raises her children and do the best she can, I'm going to have her back. And I'm not going to allow anyone to sit here and say that. And for the record, I've been married for 47 years, sir, and I raised my children with my husband. But that does not allow me to wear the me hat and look down on any woman who if she cannot feed her children. And something I want to put on the record, do you know if you have children and you want to go to work and you try to pay for child care, your whole check goes to child care. And when you say we create a system that encourages women, so if I work, and usually she'll have to work 2 jobs because of the wages are so low, and then someone will charge them for child care, or else she leaves them at home by themselves. Oh, that's illegal. So there are so many hurdles. I want to ask Ms. Hutchison, I thank you for your work, because being poor in America has been painted with this negative brush that you are lazy, you are not trying to get these jobs. There's a million jobs around you. Can you explain how in your community, West Virginia relies on SNAP? And would it mean for families and neighbors if this resource was no longer there? So paint a picture where we as a government say no more SNAP or food or assistance.
Yes. First of all, most of the people that I know who are the working poor, I think maybe one of the reasons why our unemployment numbers have fallen is because we're working 2 and 3 jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as SNAP, I live in the city. I live in one of the better off counties in the state, the northern part. And I live downtown. The Title I, the elementary school down the street from my house is a Title I school. For years, the poverty numbers in that one school were so high that every child in that school received free breakfast and lunch before other schools in the county had ever reached that mark. Now, every single school in my county receives free and reduced lunch, and I think that speaks directly to your question. You know, we struggle enough right now. The food pantries, they're under so much pressure, and we saw this during the federal shutdown last year. You know, and especially the food pantries were struggling. Most of our food pantries in my community are run out of small churches on private donations. And now they're worried that the more that we got the SNAP program, that the heavier their burden is going to be to the point where they're not going to be able to survive either.
I want to close with a statistic, sir. In 36 months before the 2016 election, the U.S. economy added more than 8 million jobs. And the labor market has, since the current president has been in office, 6.7, 36 months in the previous administration. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to come back, and hopefully what we can do is have some action items. So, Ms. Hutchinson, I heard in your opening testimony where you were talking about how actually someone gets a job and they have reduced benefits, and you know, and it's a disincentive, I guess, for keeping a job or actually having children keep a job. Is that correct? Because I heard that actually, I guess it was their wages that get calculated in according to your testimony, and it would allow them to not qualify either for housing or for assistance.
Right, so they would lose those benefits within days of reporting their income.
So if there was some way to actually protect that, where you say, okay, you get a job, and actually where you have a ramp to actually work through that, because listen, I grew up with very humble beginnings, and with a loving mother and a loving father, and yet I understand well, I don't know that I understand, but I have empathy for the stories that you're sharing with me, and what I also know is that in trying to get out of those humble beginnings, there were a lot of incentives. I mean, you know, I wanted, you know, something that maybe my neighbors had that we didn't have. And so what I would like from you, if you would get to this committee as part of a homework, not to give you homework, but if you can give me 3 things that families in West Virginia, if they had the ability to get a job, and whether it's $10 an hour, you know, $8 an hour, and how it affects those other subsidies or safety nets, what would be your recommendation on how, as a federal government, we can look at that to allow them the opportunity to live that American dream and hopefully end up like Mr. Smith, where the support was a temporary thing and not something that is a life cycle of having to have on that. Could you do that for me?
I would be honored to do that for you.
All right. Well, and Sister Campbell, here's the other area. This is not your first rodeo. You've been here before. You know how the testimony goes. And here's what I would, in terms of children and those needs, and as I said in my opening remarks, free and reduced lunch is a big thing in the western mountains of North Carolina. Sometimes it's the only decent meal that they get that day. And so to the extent that we can look at those areas that allow for children to get the assistance, and knowing also how do we put a safety net around that assistance for children that do not get sidelined because of other choices in family situations. I mean, some of the most heartbreaking things that I saw was actually money that was going to feed kids that actually got sold to buy drugs. And when you see that, we've got to figure out a way that we can actually meet the needs that we're all talking about here. And yet, if you can come up with 2 ideas in your area to provide to the committee, would you be willing to do that?
I would love to. It would be great, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the cycles of poverty and the fact that the majority of folks cycle off
Right.
assistance, just the way Mr. Smith's family did.
Right.
And so it is not this, what some folks like to call hammock or mischaracterize that way, but I'd be happy to get you that data. The other piece to know is that it's not just school lunch or breakfast, it's also weekend backpacks that many of the rural communities.
We have a backpack program that honestly has worked really well, and it's one. But in that, we're working with food banks, we're working with a number of other businesses in the areas, and sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, it is those groups that come together with a small amount of federal assistance and a whole lot of private compassion and work that actually does a much better job. Sadly, Ms. Hutchinson, you talked about what we do here in Congress and the misplaced priorities of congressional budgets. You're preaching to the choir. I mean, every day I look at things and say, why are we spending money for X, Y, and Z? And so to the extent that we can do that would be great. Is it Mr. Dutagupa? Okay, my apology. That North Carolina tongue has a harder time saying your last name. But as we look at this, here's what I would ask of you. You mentioned earlier in your testimony about how actually, I guess you said that people on SNAP and others actually have a better achievement rate. And so I would be very interested in those because, listen, I've been around long enough to know that he who pays for the study wins the study. And so I guess what I would love to do is look at the crosstabs and look at that because as a small modification, I think that's important. And I appreciate the chairman's graciousness, and all of you, if you will get that homework back to us, I think we'll be in a good place.
Look forward to it. I thank the gentleman. Gentleman from California, Mr. Khan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hutchinson, thank you for your very moving testimony. You know, one thing you said really struck me, which is that you said you're not asking people up here to give up their privilege, but to look beyond their privilege. And I thought that was quite a remarkable observation. So I wanted to give you the opportunity. I mean, if you were in Congress or if you were working for someone in Congress, what would be the main things you would do to help people?
I don't know if I'd ever be able to raise enough funds to run for Congress, but I'd look good sitting in one of those chairs one day. I think I had to check my bias, to be honest with you, walking in here, because I am so used to being told that this is my fault, that I am lazy. West Virginia has the most veterans per capita than any other state in the nation. Poverty fuels the military machine. People join the military because they're so poor they can't make it any other way. The other thing that I want to say is that sometimes when I walk into spaces like this, I struggle. I wanted to go buy new clothes for today because I felt like that's what was expected. Like I had to dress myself up to look like everybody else and to talk like everybody else. One thing, thank you for noticing your own privilege, because I think that's the first step in the right direction. The other thing is I'm very honored to be here today. I don't know why God chose me to be the one person to speak on behalf of millions of poor people, but I hope I did well. And the one thing is, if we start talking to poor folks and less about them, then that's how we're going to fix this problem. We're talking about budgets, and you give me a room full of single moms that are living on a food stamp budget, and we're going to know where every single penny goes. You know, we have so many skills because of our poverty that we don't celebrate and we don't recognize. West Virginians are the most resilient and hardest working people I have ever met. We don't know how to give up. It's in our DNA. And so we've actually worked on legislation on the state level, my organization, to try to, the bill was called Stop Punishing Work and Marriage, because what happens is when you get married or get a better paying job, you lose your benefits immediately. And so there is no way. And so the system is a handout rather than a hand up. And I think it's going to take people who are impacted by these issues sitting at the table and having real honest conversations. You explain to me what your side of it looks like. as far as numbers and policies and concerns, and I can get you a room full of impassioned women and men who would love to sit and tell you what the other side of that looks like too.
Well, thank you, Ms.
Thank you for the space.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchison, and thank you for coming here, and you're making a big impact, and you should be proud of what you're doing.
Thank you.
I want to recognize and thank Representative Ocasio-Cortez for her leadership in doing something that's long overdue and actually helps my district. I mean, the cost of living in my district is enormous, and we have a problem where people who are clearly under the poverty line aren't getting Head Start, aren't getting basic services. And so I think the legislation that the Representative Ocasio-Cortez has authored really can make a big difference. And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Datta Gupta, who I know you've done a lot of work on this issue. Why was the poverty line defined the way it was, and what would you recommend that we do to capture really what the poverty rate is?
Thank you, Congressman Khanna. So briefly, the poverty line was defined the way it was because of data limitations, because of this quest for some simplicity. But remember, even Molly Orshansky, who developed it, didn't expect it to be so durable. She thought that there would be improvements, that we would have a different poverty line by now. And what we should do is very much the sort of approach you see in Representative Ocasio-Cortez is legislation. We should have researchers and other experts, specifically including people with recent lived experience with poverty, help inform a process where we develop a poverty line and measure that is connected with people's real lives, including acknowledging the fact that there are a lot of costs that have grown substantially, like childcare, health, higher education, since the 1950s.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this matter of people women having children out of wedlock, single mothers, as it were, prompted me to go online. And I think these facts need to be in the record. In the last Republican spending bill, you know, when they were in the majority before we took over, they proposed to cut 4 million people from Title X access to birth control. In the repeal, and that, of course, did not pass. We kept it from passing. In the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, the so-called repeal and replace, you know, the replacement that never came, Senator Cruz would have permitted insurers to refuse to cover birth control. So talking about blaming the victim, blame the Congress, because women who have access to birth control embrace it, but they need to be able to afford it. And they should not, in a committee hearing like this, be made to take the blame when the blame is on the Congress. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this series of hearings. This is not the only one you're having on children in poverty. At a time when, as we heard in the State of the Union last night, there are all these jobs, they are low-wage jobs. And so I'm interested in what happens. That's where the proliferation has come. The Trump administration wants to put, after 10 years, 200,000 school-age children off of the lunch program. Either they'd have to pay for it themselves, or they'd have to pay for it themselves. They could not get what we call free lunch now. I'd like to ask you, Ms. Hutchison, it occurs to me, wait a minute, they go to school 5 days a week. What do they do on the weekends? How are they fed? Since I understand that this school lunch may be the only nutritious meal they receive.
A lot of times they rely on the backpack programs. That's very common throughout the state of West Virginia, where a church or other social service organization will make sure they have enough at least to munch on throughout the weekends. A lot of times they go to the soup kitchens and the missions, and a lot of times they just might not eat.
These programs, Mr. Chairman, are vital if you want people to have lunch. We can't do anything on the weekend, but at the very least, we shouldn't be cutting them or reducing what they receive during those 5 days. Mr. Gupta, do you have something to say on that?
Yeah, Dr. Gupta. I just want to say something about the focus on basically single mothers and primarily women of color. First, the evidence suggests that kids who grow up in single mother households actually do better than those where the parents divorce. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Single mothers are doing an amazing job raising kids who have more upward mobility in many cases. Secondly, on reproductive health, the evidence suggests this is all about whether this is a choice or not. Actually having a kid seems to have little to no effect on one's economic outcomes if you had a choice. So a lot of what's happening here is that women do not truly have the reproductive health choices that you've described, and so are harmed by that. When they can control their reproductive health decisions, the outcomes for the kids and for the women are comparable to women who don't have kids.
I remember the controversy over the Obama school lunch program, when he was indeed what that administration did was to try to replace some of this junk food, pizzas and fries and the rest, and then there was some criticism. I wonder if any of you can tell us, was that program a failure, and was the administration's, what now proposes to do is to put all that junk food back on? What should we be doing about that? Sister Campbell?
It's a great question, and what our evidence indicates, just in our anecdotal conversations around the country, is that having nutritious food for young kids is critical, and that junk food precipitates.
Weren't there some problem? Weren't there some criticism that the children might not eat what the Obama administration, the more nutritious?
Sister, you have 10 seconds in which to answer, and then I will turn to the author of the legislation at hand.
That was a concern raised by the opposition. In fact, what it appears based on teachers' reports to us is it didn't materialize. The hungry kids eat.
Thank you very much.
Wow, that was great. I thought for sure you'd fudge it. I was always influenced by nuns in my life, and I credit what I'm doing now to my 5th grade nun, who was angry at me in school and was coming down the aisle. I thought, I'm in deep trouble, and she caught herself. She pointed to me and she said, Connolly, all you need is a soapbox and you could be a politician. God bless the 5th grade nun. Now we turn, and thank you for your patience, to our colleague, Ocasio-Cortez. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I again would like to reiterate the gratitude that I have for this committee to be able to hold the space and actually have this hearing. For so long in our country, poverty has been a taboo word. It is something that we're not allowed to talk about, and it is something that we have difficulty acknowledging. And even in just the presence of this legislation that I am putting forward along with my colleagues is literally just to recognize poverty in America. That's it. Just directing someone, agencies, to just measure the level of poverty in this country. It doesn't even direct us to expand social program. We're not even there yet. We're just talking about recognizing poverty, and there is resistance to doing that. Why? Why? I believe that we do not want to recognize the level of poverty in this country, because if we did, it would be a national scandal. And we will have to force ourselves to acknowledge that our systems have failed. and that we are not doing enough by our own people in a democracy that is supposed to be by the people and for the people to serve the people of the United States of America, and we're not. And so, moving on, Ms. Hutchinson, I just want to reiterate what everyone in this room knows. You know, you said you don't know why God put you in this room. It is because you have been one of the most powerful witnesses to ever enter that I have seen in my short time here in Congress. And your testimony, I hope, will move and change the tide of how we treat poverty in this country. You know, you brought up something so important, and I want to thank you for pointing out the hypocrisy of this system. My family was poor not too long ago. Many aspects of my family are still poor. My first 3 months here in Congress, I slept on an air mattress and walked to work, and people made fun of me because I couldn't afford a second apartment. And that's with, you know, all of the privileges bestowed upon this office. You brought up something so important, which is the mental cost and price of poverty. You know, you were talking about how you felt self-conscious because you felt like you needed to buy a new outfit. And I understand because, like, no one takes the poor seriously. So we feel like we need to get all these degrees and show up dressed a certain way just so that someone can actually believe our story. But I just wanted to let you know that your story has filled up this entire room, has absolutely filled it up. And talk about some things that are crystal clear. 7 million people have not been lifted off of food stamps in this country. They were kicked off food stamps in this country. And people are going hungry. They are going hungry because we like to use the word lift instead of the truth, which was kicked. And we are booting millions of Americans into the streets because we want to believe and dupe ourselves into thinking that we're doing better. We are not. We're not. Ms. Hutchinson, I also want to thank you about bringing up the poverty draft and this idea of a bootstrap. You know, this idea and this metaphor of a bootstrap started off as a joke because it's a physical impossibility to lift yourself up by a bootstrap, by your shoelaces. It's physically impossible. The whole thing is a joke. And when we talk about this poverty draft, about lifting ourselves off the bootstraps, can you talk about that, Ms. Hutchinson? Can you talk about the poverty draft in this country?
I would love to. I think, you know, the thing is there is this assumption that if we do more, you know, I'm not doing enough to lift myself out of poverty, and that's what we keep hearing all the time. You know, what you said about kicking people off the rolls, I spent a whole summer organizing in rural food pantries across West Virginia. I know right now there's a 24-year-old woman with autism who's too high functioning for a disability check, but yet the mania associated with her autism, she has to have a very controlled environment in which to work in. Because of the waiver that West Virginia's, the work requirements, she's no longer getting SNAP benefits. Mm-hmm. You know, so those are the people that
going hungry.
Yes, and the foster kids who age out of the system, you know, who are expected to have a job. In West Virginia right now, the Department of Justice just left our state. They did an investigation because we have 7,000 children in the foster care system because of the opioid crisis. Mm-hmm. Because I had a junior in high school look at me and I said, why is everybody drunk and high? Because, you know, that's what she had just said about her school. And she said, because you can't be poor and happy at the same time. Mm-hmm. I said, you just described the opioid crisis to me in 10 words, and you're a junior in high school. Mm-hmm. You know, and so it's just, if you do more, okay, but $10 an hour is $19,000 a year. You know, what else are you supposed to do? Because to me, more at home is $10 an hour, mm-hmm. $10.50 an hour. We have 23% of West Virginia's child care workers are living in poverty.
The people caring for our own children.
The people in charge of their brain development, their socioeconomic development. Yes, ma'am.
I know I'm out of time, so I'll yield the rest of it to the chair.
Well, again, I want to thank our colleague. Thanks for your patience and waiting. We had a lot of interest, obviously, in this hearing, and I want to thank you for your leadership and your bill, and it's a privilege to co-sponsor. Let me just end by observing this. My roots, I'm the grandson of an immigrant. a woman who came from Ireland. She was a Catholic girl in Protestant Northern Ireland. She came over to the United States in 1920 at the age of 18. She had no skill, except she could sew. She had no education. And when I came along, I decided to look up my Irish roots a little bit. You know what's eerie? If you read about the Irish famine, which was an early form of genocide, a third of the population of Ireland died. Another third emigrated, came here. There were British laws at the time that forbade the Irish in their own country from fishing. There were British laws that forbade the Irish from owning their own land. There were British laws that forbade the Irish from speaking their own tongue or benefiting from their own farming or to get an education. But if you read the British official reactions to the famine, it's eerily similar to what we hear today. It's your own fault. You're lazy. You have too many children. You're illiterate. Somehow intrinsically there's something wrong with you. Even though, to come to that conclusion back in the 1840s, you had to ignore all of the systemic, structural laws and impediments that made it impossible for the Irish to frankly survive when a famine hit their primary food source. We have to get over this idea that there's something wrong with you. Are we a community, one nation, indivisible under God or not? Because if we are, then we help each other. We recognize that through no fault, somebody is in a state we can do something about. And that's the ethos we ought to embrace. My Catholic social justice doctrine teaches me that. But so does my citizenship, proud citizenship in this country, because that's who we are as Americans. Thank you for being here today. Ms. Hutchinson, you look great. And thank you for your courage. Thank you for your courage. And I promise this will be a dialogue we will continue. I have a whole bunch of things to enter into the record before I adjourn the hearing. And I ask unanimous consent that they be entered into the record. There's no objection. It helps to be last, doesn't it? And all members will have 5 days, legislative days, within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. And again, I thank everybody for being here today. This is the beginning of this discussion, not the end. God bless you all. Thank you. We are adjourned.